I'm Sandra Serkes. I am the President, CEO, and co-founder of Valora Technologies. We've been around for 15 years working in eDiscovery and information and document management. And I'm going to be talking to you today about some of the differences between information governance and eDiscovery. So the first kind of thing to think about between these two disciplines is that they can sometimes get confused. And there's a good reason for that, because there are a lot of similarities between them. They almost always both deal with large and complex document populations, and there are elements of managing risk in each one. There's also sometimes, like with Valora, some overlap in the service providers who work in these markets. But that's about it. There are way more differences than there are similarities, and I'm going to talk to you about 5 or 6 of them today. The first key difference between information governance and eDiscovery is the primary objective of the task. In eDiscovery, the primary objective is to basically take a very large pool of documents and through various technologies winnow them down to the set that you will use at trial, or maybe at settlement, but to ultimately start large and get small. That's really not the objective in information governance. The primary objective is to make sense of the documents that exist. It's not particularly to get rid of any. There may be some that can be defensively deleted, but that's almost a sideline objective. The main point around information governance is to classify and organize and control content as opposed to just getting rid of whatever doesn't suit your purpose that minute. So that is a fundamental difference that really drives the whole process of the two different areas of practice. With eDiscovery, there are mechanisms that are built in the whole technique about reducing documents. You have things like contract attorneys and predictive coding as ways to minimize collections. In information governance, the drive is more about actually working with the content of the documents to try and classify them, store them, put them in kind of a taxonomic structure so that they can be later retrieved more easily. The second key difference between the two areas is the notion of time, the time frame. By definition, eDiscovery has a fixed time window. The discovery period will have a specific starting point and a specific ending point, both of which are, by definition, in the past. And so your window of documents, your window of information is fixed at both ends. So it's finite. In information governance, that's really not the case. You might have a starting time window where the group says, this is where we're going to start from, but there really isn't an ending window. It's an ongoing or evergreen scenario because the documents in question are still being born every minute. You may have a large stockpile. We're going to start to take control of, let's say, all documents from the year 2000 and forward, but that includes the next document that is created by somebody at their desk or the next email that comes into any inbox, and so on today, tomorrow, next week, next year, and so on. So the kinds of solutions that you find in the two arenas are very different. The eDiscovery timeframe, first of all, can be very compressed. You're under a court deadline, you have a docket you have to pay attention to, and so these solutions tend to be, I wouldn't say slapdash, that's not fair, but there's a certain amount of just get it done, just cull. They're a little bit brute force. Over in information governance, particularly because there's going to be a long time frame, in theory forever, evaluation period, there's much more focus on the right tool, the right system, and more importantly, whether that can be adapted over time. Because what works today may not be, just think of like a taxonomic folder structure. What you have today may not be enough or may have extraneous branches 6 years from now. And so the solutions that get put into place have to have a certain amount of flexibility, whereas in eDiscovery they can be a little bit more off the shelf. So that kind of lends over in the eDiscovery space, and what we are seeing today is quite a bit of commoditization about the tools. They're fairly rote. They do the same thing over and over, and most of eDiscovery can be handled in this kind of off-the-shelf product-y kind of manner. In information governance, that's really not the case. The adaptability, the customization to each unique environment, let alone over time, kind of forces a very different kind of consultative, sort of workflow-driven kind of discussion. It's not so much about tools as it is about capabilities and adaptation and customization. Usually it's a much more specific and dedicated environment that people are implementing. One of the big differences between, I'll say, most eDiscovery and most information governance is that eDiscovery is essentially a batch process. Someone does some collections. Here are the pile of documents. They're FTP'd over to where they're going, and they're ultimately going to live in a database. That is batch processing. Here's the giant pile. Let's cull, let's reduce, let's filter, and let's host. And it's being done in this kind of batch way. In information governance, you actually have two worlds. There's a batch notion for what we would call backfile documents or records. So those are all the documents or all the information that's been accrued to date. Just to use our example from before, if it's from the year 2000, it would be through today, February 3rd, 2016, that would be the back file. But you also have the go forward, the documents that are going to get created this evening or tomorrow or the next day. And so you have kind of a dual environment in information governance. You have the back file, which is going to be a little bit more batch oriented. Here's the big pile. And then you have kind of more of a singleton view. Here's a document, or an email, a file, whatever it's going to be, a little bit more one-off. And so there's a couple ramifications for this. When you're doing batch processing, by definition, you are sort of offline of the originating source of the documents. In eDiscovery, it's almost always a completely separate copy of the documents from their origin. So you have a completely separate set, and you have this kind of batch processing technique. In information governance, once you're through the back file, you're no longer in a batch mode. You're in a real-time or near real-time status. A document is born, it's going to get classified, cataloged, and placed in the proper location, probably in a matter of seconds. It's just a kind of real-world example. When Valora is doing this kind of work, we're usually under an SLA to have that document turned in 60 seconds. Just to give you a feel for how real-time that's actually occurring. So you have, when you're in a batch environment, and when you're in a, I'll say, offline environment, in other words, offline of the true documents, and then that's on purpose because you don't want to have any spoliation. You need them to be protected. In information governance, you're actually working with the live documents that are in use by the organization. So there has to be a little bit of clever registration of ownership, who's actually in a document at any given time, and who has what I'll call kind of the trumping powers on the other, to name a document, to determine whether or not it should be in legal hold, to determine its classification or who has access to the document. All of those are standard IG kinds of questions, but they need to be resolved in real time. Well, first of all, they need to be resolved at all, and then they need to be resolved in real time. In the eDiscovery world, you really don't have any of those issues because it is a separate offline copy of documents. At the end of an eDiscovery matter, typically, that because it's a secondary environment, those repositories are basically going to be flushed out. The case is settled, everybody's happy, those documents can now be eliminated, removed. And they're not going to have a kind of continued life or purpose or existence after the end of the case. That's really not true in information governance. These are live documents. They're going to live for whatever their retention schedule is, and they're going to certainly continue to live after they have been processed and evaluated and metadata added. So it's there are notions of storage and revisions or kind of versions of a document. So you might have 6 or 7 later copies of a document that you need to track. Which ones would you keep? Which ones would you dispose of? Which one is a sort of master file, given that there are multiple versions out there? One of the things that we work with when we work with clients is rules and policies around what should constitute a master document. And when I say a master document, I mean something like, take something simple like an expense report. This is the master version, and we want all subsequent expense reports to follow suit on this. So that's a kind of very special status. It's sort of like a super document, and it really should never be deleted, and it should never be allowed to be altered or have some other master take its place unless that's an explicit decision. So these are some of the nuances that come into play in information governance that you really don't have in eDiscovery because it's offline, because it's a secondary set, and because ultimately it's going to be disposed of. In eDiscovery, I mentioned this earlier, part of the reason that you have a secondary set and sort of a petrified set, in other words, a sort of snapshot view of the documents as they were at the time, is because you don't want to get into any spoliation where the document content has actually been changed by the processing efforts. That would be a major no-no. In information governance, sometimes people are shocked to understand that the processing actually does change the content of the record intentionally. So, for example, you might actually want to change the file name or the title of that document because it was generated by a system. Technically, its file name is 123456.doc. That's not very helpful. Whereas when you're doing some kind of document analytics, it's going through, it's looking at the content, and it says, oh, actually, this should be titled Agreement Between Party A and Party B, June 2014. That's a far more useful title or file name than 123456. And so in some information governance capacities, the content of the document or its metadata or both are actually going to be changed on purpose so that that document going forward, remember it's a live document, is going to have more use and more purpose and more retrievability down the line. That's something you would never ever do in eDiscovery. That could probably get you sanctions. So it's a very different view on, is the content sacrosanct, who owns it, who kind of rules it, and does that content kind of flow or change over time depending on different criteria or different objectives or different strategies in play at the time. Another version of that might be where a document lives. If you have a specific folder taxonomy on day one, a document might live here and maybe it's sort of more generic folder. As time goes on and more leaves get added to the tree, that document might need to move to something a little more specific or a little more date-oriented as the document's content ages. And so those are very legitimate and smart reasons to technically change either the content or the metadata about a file. And you do see that in information governance. Sometimes hard for eDiscovery trained people to swallow. So that's why I mention that, because it's okay. The last thing that I would talk about is the notion of error tolerance. When you're in eDiscovery, there really is a very low tolerance for error. It really can't be that this was technically a privileged document, but you made a mistake and you didn't mark it as such and it got produced. That's pretty much a crisis scenario. If you're lucky, you'll have a clawback, and hopefully that will save your bacon, but it may not. And so that is a kind of a huge issue. And so the error tolerance, because it's so low in eDiscovery, there are a lot of systems in place to try and catch problems. That's why you have contract attorneys and layers of effectively quality control as you winnow down the documents, so that there is at least one, if not more, sets of eyes on the task to kind of prevent any error. It's sort of, in my view, it's sort of like the Department of Defense ultra super, careful handling of documents. That is not always necessary in the information governance space, because the kind of penalty of an error is basically pretty low. If a document got misclassified and now it's over in this folder instead of that folder, or it had a slightly inferior title than it could have had, those are effectively small-scale errors. Not to say they might not cause a headache, I'm sure they would, but they're probably not going to cause sanctions. And so because of that, there's much greater error tolerance over in information governance, which lends itself to a far more automated process. You don't need layers and layers and layers of eyes checking the quality of the data, because it's just not that much of a crisis if it's slightly wrong, or maybe there isn't any, that file didn't get any treatment for whatever reason. The error condition is just not as onerous, and so you can automate the heck out of it without a lot of downside. What that ultimately means is that the kind of cost to do an information governance project, let's say for the equivalent amount of files, is going to be much, much lower in information governance than it is in eDiscovery. And it's in part the error tolerance and the ability to automate that's driving that. I invite you to contact me anytime. I'm S. Serkes, that's SSERKES, at valoratech.com. Or you can call us anytime at 781-229-2265. Thanks.